Okay, welcome to part 2 of our series on Strategic 360 feedback. In this part, I'm going to be sharing a case study in which I illustrate what Strategic 360 feedback looks like. It's one of the more interesting case studies I've worked on, frankly, in my career, and I hope you find it interesting as well. So I call this using 360 feedback to build better leaders and create a high-performance culture. So in this case study, this is an organization, I'll get into some of the details, but really was using 360 not just to build individual leaders, but very intentional around how to shift the culture of the organization through the leadership and move from a sort of get things done in a careful, methodical way to a much more high-achieving, high-efficiency, and not as collaborative, but much more rapid pace kind of orientation. So this particular system that we were working with was an IT function within a US-based company, fairly large size, and we were contracted to work directly with the CIO and all of the leaders within the function, basically. So pretty much anyone that was reporting, had a direct reports, was working with us in the process. And again, back to this notion I talked about earlier around census participation, he really wanted to make sure that he could use this as a vehicle to communicate and drive change down through the organization. So in the first part, I talked a little bit about these levels of strategic use. And clearly, as we'll see in this case, this was a very business-driven approach to 360s. This was a process that was used every single year on a rhythm. It was fit within the performance management cycle. Typically, it was actually done after the performance management cycle. So it was clearly around development, but it was also, but it was very much built into the rhythm of the organization. And as you'll see, it focused on both individual development, very important, but also aggregating that up at the organization level to try to drive decision making within the organization, at least within the IT function. So the challenge that we faced when we arrived was this particular CIO was concerned with the culture of the department. Felt that the sort of drive for business results was not really there in the way that he wanted it to be, and so was trying to use this as a method to level things up. Importantly, when we arrived, there was the environment was really fairly cynical. There had been some difficult transitions with prior CIOs. The new CIO was coming in. There was lots of kind of infighting and worrying about silos and turfism. And so the first phase was to try to get through that cynicism and get people working together more across their various kind of sub-functions. And so that was really the goal as it was presented to us. And I think at the time, I don't know that there was a full plan on where it was going to go. The first bit was let's get past this cynicism and get people working together. But as we moved along, and as you'll see as I roll the case out, the next phase was, okay, now that we've been working together and we're cooperating, let's focus on results. We got to move a little quicker. We got to make decisions. Let's get things done, so to speak. And then finally, there was a move toward innovating and really trying to create some transformational change for the organization. And so, as we'll see, I'll break the case study into these different phases. At each phase, tweaks in the 360 process were used to accomplish these very sort of cultural shifts that the CIO saw as needed, and he was very active in designing and implementing, and also, by the way, getting his own feedback, the 360 feedback process. All right, so let's jump into phase 1 and see what it looked like. So again, there was quite a bit of mistrust and cynicism in the organization. There was very, when he was brought in, as I mentioned, there had been a couple of prior CIOs that had really driven fear down through the organization. When he came in, people were pretty cynical, and there was, very low tolerance for risk. It was kind of, protect yourself sort of was the orientation. And so, in these first 3 years, we were trying to push through that, and I use this quote here to illustrate an aspect of the process. So, in the process, what we first did was to step in and customize the survey. So we spent some time with the CIO saying, what behaviors would you like to see from your leaders? And let's build that model out and start being specific about it. We wanted to make sure there was an orientation so that we sat down with leaders and said, look, this is what we're doing. Here's what the process is. It's confidential. It's for development. You're the only ones going to get the report. You're going to get some support afterwards. And then, of course, we are going to roll it up and look at kind of group-wide results, but it won't be about any individual, and there won't be any decisions made. So sort of creating a sense of safety. But it was interesting in this orientation, we did hear, I remember hearing one person in the back literally say, oh, I've done this before. This is how they start to fire people. So important to recognize that when you're implementing a process like this, while I think there was some desire to move it quickly into being able to make decisions about people, certainly not firing people, but from a development perspective, you've got to be aware that if there is this level of mistrust, making sure the process is designed in a way that supports people and builds them up and is absolutely not used to fire people is very important, so that the leaders themselves start using it as a tool. So just to give you an idea of what we were doing from a content perspective during these first few years, some of the items that we used were things like, seeks information from appropriate sources before making a decision, right? Are you just making decisions on your own, or are you actually collaborating with your colleagues who might have an important, yes, you've got the hardware, but does the software fit? That sort of thing. Challenging assumptions when appropriate. There was, as I mentioned, very little risk tolerance, seeing risks as opportunities. So these things were things that the CIO wanted to message were critical for leaders to do, but that they were not necessarily assuming at the outset were things that were expected of them. I love the approaches change with a positive attitude. We found, again, a lot of that mistrust surfacing, and people sort of asking themselves, do I really need to do that? Well, yes, you do. So in this way, the survey was really driving the message across the organization, and every leader was getting feedback on the extent to which they were exhibiting these behaviors that the CIO valued and needed to see start to change in the organization. Now, importantly, they're getting this feedback, but it's not just, here's your report, good luck. No, in fact, we included some confidential coaching where each leader spent an hour with a coach, actually, who's a real expert, not just in how to read the report and understand it, but really how to help that person find what they needed to focus on from a change perspective to improve their leadership in the organization. That sort of one-on-one follow-up, as we saw in the first study, or the first part of our series, is very, very common. Almost 2/3 of the organizations do this, and it's because this is where the value comes in this process. It really helps assure usage. So let's take a look then at our model for behavior change and see how the design features show up in terms of driving change in this particular case. So if we look back at our model here, we talked in the first part about relevant content, credible data, accountability, and then again census participation as being critical components to drive change both at the individual level and at the organization level. Well, if we look at our process steps, so the orientation, what's the orientation doing? The orientation's helping build credible data, right? That's probably the biggest component here. It gives people the sense of, okay, these data are being collected confidentially. I understand the process. I can believe that there's value in it. The custom survey, clearly directly related to content that's relevant. It was in the terms and the kind of verbiage that was familiar to them. Again, that credibility from the leaders only getting the report was very important. But we wanted some accountability. Now, I will say at this phase, really most of the accountability was through the coaching. So the idea that someone's going to meet with me, I need to have read it, and I'm going to walk out with something that I need to focus on. So accountability at this early phase was really quite a bit less emphasized than maybe some of the other pieces, because we were very aware of the culture that we were stepping into and the potential, and we heard it with the quote, the potential for people really rejecting the process. So accountability was less emphasized early on, but census participation was critical, and that was very valuable for being able to let us get those group-wide results. And as we'll see in a bit, those group results were extremely helpful for the CIO to be going back to the organization and saying, hey, look, this is where we're at. This is where we need to keep growing. Let's keep moving. So there was a double back element from an accountability and a direction standpoint. He also used that quite a bit to help guide some of the development that leaders are being given as a group, sort of leadership development coursework and that sort of thing. So after these first 3 years, what we found is that the first year was a lot of skepticism. By the third year, people were really starting to accept it. They were really accepting the feedback as valuable and useful. They were valuing their time and taking good advantage of that coaching, very comfortable with the process. But what we started to realize is that the CIO was saying, okay, I think I'm ready to start moving a little bit. I feel like I've gained people's trust. I've earned their confidence in me, and I'm seeing some improvements. Let's try to level up the game a little bit. The other thing that was happening is there were some interesting environmental circumstances. So right about this time, there were some pretty significant macroeconomic issues going on, and there were some budget cuts that occurred. And so at the same time there were budget cuts happening, this particular group was taking on a whole new phone system. There were a lot of pressures around getting results, getting business-related outcomes that people could believe in. The IT department really hadn't had a lot of successes, so their customers weren't real happy with their work. That had started to change in the first couple years, where they started working together a little better. So by this second phase in years 4 through 6, we started to see a real shift in terms of business results being prioritized. There was a lot more kind of confidence in the leadership, even a sense of pride in the organization itself, some optimism, and there was really this question around reliability versus innovation. So this idea that, hey, we need to be continuing to deliver for the business in sort of an innovative way versus no, we just need to be kind of consistent. It was quite important, however, that phone system got rolled out. That was a very high-touch system, touched the entire organization. It was very high risk, but it was also very successful. So at this time, when budget cuts were happening, they were actually able to get some very visible, very significant business benefits from their system. The cost savings and efficiency and feature set that they were able to get was just quite remarkable across the business. So at the same time that we're seeing this kind of focus toward the business, we start shifting the process. So what we realized is, people are pretty comfortable. They know most of these leaders, very little turnover. Most of these leaders are aware of what the process is. They're comfortable with it. So we're going to actually nix the orientation. We're not going to do the orientation anymore, but we are going to start folding in some custom norms. So we're going to actually put some normative data on there, start making a little bit more accountability around, I thought a 4 was good, but I guess the norm is more like 4.25. That sort of thinking. The other thing we started doing is writing up coach notes. So the coaches would actually write up, after their sessions, they would write up what the key kind of development areas were, and those notes would get pushed to the person's manager. So now you can see we're starting to level in accountability a little bit more. And that would go not just to their manager, but to the individual themselves, in an effort to leverage the manager relationship to continue the development conversation. So still not about performance management or anything like that, but trying to engage that leader and their manager in working together around development. and then of course continuing with the group results. So it's sort of tweaking the process as the organization is shifting and the needs are shifting. And that sort of evolving process also very importantly was embedded within the content. So we actually evolved the content quite significantly over this first phase. So we had in the first year a very collaboration-oriented survey. By the second year, there were some kind of smaller tweaks that we wanted to do. But in that fourth year, we worked with the CIO around no, we really need to level up the game. And then even in the sixth year, we leveled it up further. So I want to give you some examples of what that looked like, but not only changing the process itself and the features, but actually changing the survey to reflect what behaviors that leader needed to see to move the culture where he wanted it to go was very, very important. So just to give you kind of a flavor of what that evolution looked like. The first bit was around collaboration. So this is the set of competencies that we used, and it included things like systems thinking and certainly collaboration, managing change, empowering people. Bias for action was a really big one. People tended to kind of analysis by paralysis. So, on the one hand, it was, are they thinking across the system? Are they thinking siloed? On the other hand, are they, just sitting on a decision forever, sort of thing. We even had bias for learning, right? Are people trying to learn and get better, which of course is really important in their space, but very sort of collaboration focused. As we moved into the next phase, we actually eliminated a couple of these competencies. So, as the CIO said, it was something along the lines of, okay, I'm tired of all this navel gazing. Let's move on. Let's start getting some results. Let's focus more on bias for action and less on bias for learning. Again, not that learning wasn't important, but he really wanted to be messaging that we needed to level up the game. And so as we moved into that phase, we changed out the competencies. In the final phase, around innovation, we got even more radical, and we actually really eliminated a lot of the competencies, really only keeping accountability and bias for action, and adding in things like excellence and innovation and team leadership. So really, the content itself is mirroring where he needed to see the organization move. Now, what I find particularly interesting is not just at the competency level, but if you look at how we created the changes within the survey content, I think you'll see that from a leader's perspective, they're getting messages around where they need to change and how they need to level up their behavior at a very specific level. So, for example, there were some incremental changes in that first year. I talked about, we would move from, say, treats coworkers equitably and fairly to things like treats others equitably and fairly, and then into treats others with professionalism and respect. So instead of just being equal and fair, it's no, professionalism and respect. We need to kind of level up our game a little bit and not just make everyone feel okay, but again, treat them with respect, but push the envelope a little bit more. So holding others accountable for delivering results, but also within budget and per specification, which if you've ever worked with an IT department can be a real issue. So while in year one, I don't think the CIO was comfortable going to this level, by year 6, he was saying, no, we have to hit the budget, we have to hit the specification, not just focus on getting something done. And so here again, you see the mirror to the way the culture is shifting. So in the beginning, there was all this cynicism and people were being bitter and throwing, problem, we'll never make it. But that evolves by level. So suggesting solutions to problems was important, but by year 6, it's more like suggesting solutions instead of focusing on problems. There also were some radical changes. So if we look at year 1, things like setting challenging yet appropriate goals sets high performance standards. So that's a big shift, right? You don't have that kind of caveat in there. Considering the impact of his or her decisions on multiple stakeholders considers long-term business consequences of decisions. You can see here that if we had started in year 6 with the year 6 content in year 1, it probably would have been rejected. So working collaboratively with clients develops practical solutions based on client needs and financial considerations. So rather than just responding to, well, what did the client want? It's what does the client want, but also how do we balance that with the needs of the organization from a financial perspective? Generating innovative solutions rather than just same old, becomes identifying transformational changes to improve the business. You can see that the behaviors that CIO is messaging across the organization are really quite different by year 6. But again, he could never have done it if he started there. So evolving that content to move the culture where you want it to move can be done literally through the content of the survey. I mentioned we also threw in some normative data, so literally in their reports being able to compare. The group level results I think were quite interesting. We were able to look and show them year over year what their top behaviors were across the organization and where those changes were going up or going down. You can see here we also even indicate which one was the highest overall behavior or lowest overall behavior from a prior year. So aggregating those data up and being able to look at the trends across the organization became really a critical view, and really was very helpful for this CIO to be able to talk about the aggregate, not about individuals, but here's who we are as a group and where we as a group need to move. In fact, I think frankly he probably didn't even really focus much on the numbers and more on the individual items themselves. As I mentioned, the coach notes became a really critical tool for accountability. Being specific about what are the things that this person's focusing on, really only giving 3, no more than 3 of these individuals, but being very specific. So these development priorities that our coaches were delivering were not, were derived directly out of the conversation, were in no way boilerplate. They were actually written specifically to that person and that context. You can see even in this first one, given your new tenure to the organization, timing is probably perfect for this conversation. So really very contextualized, very individualized coach notes that go to the boss so the boss can follow up on the development, but less so about the numbers and the scores in the report. So again, let's take a look and consider which of these design elements are driving change. You can see that accountability in the form of the norms, in the form of the coach notes, is starting to be accentuated quite a bit more. So as we move into phase 2, certainly accountability becomes a bigger piece of it. Again, as I mentioned, if we had started with accountability, probably would have been rejected outright by the system. Now, by the time we get into year 7, the CIO is really ready to start, as they say, sort of cooking with gas. He's saying, all right, great, I got their trust, I got them focused on the needs of the business. Now we need to really move into a phase where we're doing some radical improvements, that sort of transformational changes to benefit the business, kind of embody the overall perspective that he had. So this innovation phase, as I showed before, there certainly were some changes in the content. But during this phase, also from a business perspective, they launched a number of new initiatives from a technology standpoint that were quite impactful, cut across the entire organization in terms of, you start changing everyone's email and calendar, you're going to catch the attention of your customer. So again, had they started trying to do this in year 1, there was just no faith internally or in their customer base. But by the time they get to year 7, they're really ready to make huge changes. Not that they weren't making changes and tweaking things and continuing to support the organization, but very transformational in terms of the kinds of implementations they were doing across the organization. They also started really promoting from within. There was quite a bit of new growth in that regard. There was some interesting sort of now you got a little bit of sort of inside outside or in group out group stuff, and really feeling like they weren't appreciated because they felt like they were working really well as a team. And they really were able to integrate the notion of collaborating together, but to get results. And boy, the numbers in terms of their customer satisfaction, their openness to risk, and trying to just radically changing during this period. So, a lot of shifts in terms of the way the organization is seeing itself. There were a couple of big shifts later in the year. They had a quite significant security issue in year 9, which probably would have resulted in outsourcing their entire department. Had it happened in year 2, they were able to survive it and get through it quite well, actually. And then they also had some governance things toward the end here that they needed to kind of do some better alignment and make things a little bit more efficient. So in the innovation phase, a real shift, and likewise we see a real shift in the way the process was working. So this is an example of a quote one of our coaches shared, where she started seeing the individuals getting feedback coming into those coaching sessions saying, oh, yeah, I chose my peers because I wanted to focus on these particular individuals. So at this point, leaders are starting to use the 360 process as a tool for them to learn about their leadership. They're very active in the tool. Again, this notion of sort of business business-oriented, highly strategic use of 360. It's happening every year, so they're thinking about it as how can I use this to become a better leader in a very proactive way. In this phase, we actually added in a couple of very interesting components. So trying to, again, level up the conversation around accountability. We introduced three-way coaching. I'll talk a little bit about that. We start giving the person's manager, a copy of the report, and then we start breaking apart some of the group results to help some of the senior directors be able to look at their own group and do some talent development work. And we also importantly start including our coaches in the talent review conversation. So as they're identifying succession and as they're reviewing each of their individual leaders from a development and growth standpoint, and trying to, in this case, they were using a sort of a 9-block tool. Our coaches are actually in the room sort of keeping those leaders honest. If you've ever been in those rooms, it can be a little political and a little, my person needs to advance kind of thing. And so having a coach in the room that's not only seeing the data, but has seen the person work with the data was really valuable, I think, particularly to the CIO for kind of getting a level set and making sure that the wool wasn't being pulled over his eyes, so to speak. So what we start seeing here is that even the survey content, so if we look at the survey content, it's really starting to change the conversation. So just the fact that we introduced this new survey with new business components, new paradigms, really changed the conversation that leaders are having about their own effectiveness. So rather than that, the shift in that content was around trying to really be transformational, not just incremental innovation, but transformational changes, even further increasing the business focus, trying to get leaders to not just react to clients, but be proactive and bringing them solutions before they even realize they need it, introducing new technologies that might help lever the business forward rather than just being a reactive sort of service provider. So, some of the kinds of things that we're hearing in those coaching sessions, and this was one of my favorites, we heard this a lot, was, we would hear, well, what is exactly transformational change for my position? One of the things we found that was kind of interesting is that each leader would get sort of low scores, particularly in the first couple of years on this item, develops transformational changes to benefit the business. And they'd get low scores from their boss. So often what would come out of that is, well, go talk to your boss. Your boss obviously sees that there's something you could do to really level up your innovation. So go talk to your boss about what he or she sees you could be doing. Interestingly, of course, we're working with all 4 levels within the organization. So we're also going to work with the boss and look at his or her feedback. And interestingly, almost to a person, they too got a low rating from their boss, but not themselves, on the same item. So again, at every level, it sort of cascaded up that their boss saw opportunities, but they didn't. So the point here is that, again, the content itself is starting to drive conversations through the entire leadership around their own development that the CIO wants them to be having to move their strategy forward, to be more innovative, to add more value to the organization, simply by changing the content of the survey and enforcing the conversation with a coach who can help them kind of process it through. So here again, looking back at our model, recognizing that relevant content is a key lever for driving change. So again, one of those key levers we talked about, sort of adding in the accountability component, was this three-way coaching. So there was an awareness that when we were sending the coach notes out to the manager and out to their individual, we would come back the next year and say, okay, so how did that conversation go? And what we found was that about half the people were meeting with their manager and had talking through their coach notes. 100% of the people wanted to have that meeting, but unfortunately their boss was too busy, didn't take the time, and about half of them just didn't feel comfortable pushing in and saying, hey, let's talk about this. So what we developed was this three-way coaching conversation where our coaches would meet with the individual for an hour, identify what are those key areas that need to be developed, those top three, and then immediately after that first hour, their boss would come in for a 30-minute meeting, and the three of them would discuss those key development areas and get input from the boss. So you kind of start the conversation right away, no delay whatsoever. And then we would, of course, follow up with the coach note going, again, back out to the individual leader and to their boss, so they had a reference point. But what we found is this was a huge force multiplier in terms of quickly and effectively getting their leaders to start focusing on those things and having the support and the accountability from their manager to work on those areas that were emerging from the report and from the data as most important for them. This was just a really critical component, and again, truly getting the accountability piece in there. I will say, going back to the sequence, if we had tried this at year one, it would not have worked at all. There was no trust in the organization. And so even the first year we did this, there was a little bit of trepidation. By the second year, there was a considerable amount of eagerness, and people, again, were very happy that they were able to kind of get that conversation, that meaningful development conversation with their boss, and kind of get jump-started right away. So these elements of this process, you can see, again, the evolution of adding in these components, doing them at the right time with some thought and mindfulness toward strategically leveling up and changing the culture of the organization. So we also got to collect a little bit of data, and there were a few each year we would kind of look at group-wide trends, and these, I think, were data that the CIO in particular found very valuable for his own kind of planning, but also he would often share them out. So we saw some things, for example, in year 9, we were able to look at the kind of the old, I kind of hate the old component here because it wasn't really old, but as contrasted to new. So the long tenured, if you will, or folks that had been in the organization for a long time, versus the newer managers, to see, well, what are those differences? Are there any differences between these folks on these dimensions? And we found some interesting trends here, where indeed the established, perhaps is a better term, the established managers that had been there for a long time were often actually better at planning and delegating, but the new leaders were maybe a little bit better at self-awareness. So this is kind of an interesting thing where we saw some differences in these patterns. Perhaps one of the most potent analyses that we did across those years was the next year, however, when we were able to look and say, well, let's take a look across. We actually took a look across the entire 10-year span and said, all right, well, let's look at the scores for the leaders who had been lost. So these are folks who had either resigned, had been let go. There was, as I mentioned, there was a layoff, or had been fired. And let's compare all of those folks to the leaders who were still in the organization across the time. And of course, in some cases, we didn't have complete data for each one, so it narrowed down a little bit. Important to note here that, and of course, the finding was quite clear that the people that they had retained were quite a bit better leaders than the leaders that had left. So, certainly contributing to the message around an improving organization and leveling up. Important to note that in no case, and we were pretty close to this, pretty confident this is the case, in no case were the 360 scores themselves used to make any of these decisions. It was always, and this is almost always the case, that the 360 sort of reflects issues that are then showing up on business results and other tangible performance metrics that are clearly things that are going to be driving individuals out. So I think the organization was pretty comforted that, in fact, the leaders that they had been retaining over these many years were in fact the better leaders, and that the organization was getting better. The other thing we talked about, though, is these subgroup profiles. So we were also able in these later phases to go look under, for example, a senior director and say, all right, let's look at the competency scores across all 5 of the leaders that report directly into you, so you can get a sense of what is that profile. And of course, they had the actual names, so they knew who they were dealing with and could do their own kind of talent management practices, but trying to get at what is the profile of your group, where are the issues. And so in many cases, they would look at this and they would say, well, that makes sense. Leader 2 and leader 3 really are quite different. Leader 3 really is sort of my superstar, and boy, I really am struggling with leader 2. But in many cases, this really helped make it clear and make it sort of pop as to where the strengths and weaknesses were within their team. And then again, our coach would work with each of them to kind of think through, well, what kind of planning can you do with your group given these profiles. We're also able, you can see there's a color coding here, so you've got kind of the green, the red, the teal, and the purple there. We can aggregate those up to simplify the data, make it a little easier to read. And so in this case, you can see they kind of aggregated those up into, develop, deliver, inspire, and challenge were kind of how they bucketed those. And you can see again, where those leaders separate out. And again, leader 3 sort of showing up as really the superstar, and leader 2 having some challenges, particularly around inspire. Some of the things that they're able to do in this case is to see that, leader 2, even leader 4 might be someone I could pair with leader 2 in a mentoring environment or something along those lines to help on some of these inspire competencies. So the data here are helping to kind of piece together ways in which leaders can work with their directs from a talent management development standpoint. So let's go back to our model again, and I hit it a little bit as I went, but just to be really concrete, what are the components in the process that are driving change, and what are the elements of the model that are being emphasized? So as I talked about, certainly 3-way coaching, the manager reports. So the managers were getting at those subgroup reports. They also were getting the competency level data sent directly to them, and certainly the talent review conversations we're having are all really starting to emphasize the accountability portion of the equation. But you can see how the process evolved over time. We didn't start with this emphasizing accountability. There was a little bit of it because the coach was in there. You're gonna talk to someone who's gonna hold you accountable, but way different than actually having your boss come in immediately after and have the conversation. So these things sort of evolved and built on each other, and all, again, though, within the model. And what we started seeing was huge shifts in the way the leaders were functioning and working and driving the culture that they were trying to get, and in the business results. If you think about, if they had said, oh, well, let's introduce a new calendar, a new email, let's respond to a security event and do all that in the first year, it would have been an extraordinary challenge for them. They really would have struggled. But by the time we get toward the end here in this case, they were able to get quite a bit more business results because of their focus on continuing to level up that culture. So one of the great things, it's a rare time when you get to work with an individual client and, frankly, individual set of leaders. Particularly, we're working often with these leaders over, an extended period, seeing the same leader year in and year out, helping them grow, level up. In some cases, I can think of at least one manager who, we worked with the second month, she became a manager for the first time, and by the end of the case, she was a senior director and being considered even as a possible successor to the CIO. So to see that kind of growth over the years is just so rare and a great gift. So we do have even some data we can look at. So a couple things to recognize. First, from the get-go, we had really, really strong response rates. People voting with their feet. People were, at the end of the day, willing to participate, give their feedback, and very engaged in helping their leaders to get better. I think particularly as time went on, people became more and more comfortable with giving data, and we really had great response rates. Usually we think of 70% as just minimum threshold. Our targets at 3D Group, we usually are shooting for the 85+% rate and getting pretty good results there, and this certainly was no exception. But again, year in, year out, great participation. We're also able to look, and of course the survey changes limit this a little bit, but we're also able to look at how the organization changed over time and what those various kind of year-over-year trends are. And interestingly, this is a pretty common example. So the new survey in year 10, what we often see is a dip like this, and this is kind of a note of caution, I guess, to anyone who's trying to use a 360 to evaluate a program, is often after the first year, there is a dip in scores because of just the familiarity. People become more familiar and comfortable sort of learning effects with the behaviors. They're paying attention to them more, basically, and aware more of things, again, like that transformational change. Oh yeah, I noticed that this year, and I paid more attention to it. The first year I filled it out, it was a little bit more vague, but the second year I was really focusing and recognizing those behaviors more. But what we saw overall is, again, over time, leaders really using these development activities to improve and develop themselves. One of the other things we do is we take a look at those development goals. So we can actually take a look at the development goals over the entire span here from when we started doing them and writing them down from the coach notes, and see what are the kind of areas. We aggregate them up. They aren't always worded exactly the same, but we do some combining based on the actual content. And what we find is some pretty clear trends in the way development is looking within the group. So we were able to report back. Obviously, it's pretty small and difficult to read. So let me give you kind of what the top 10 looked like in terms of what leaders are actually working on and developing. So again, performance management, trying to hold their employees accountable, delegating some of the basics, as we talked about, innovation being important. Impact, influence, often a challenge within an IT department. So you can see when you get groups of development goals that look like this is guiding. They actually had an internal OD person who would take a look at these data and be working on, hey, let's do a couple of workshops for leaders on impact and influence. Let's do a couple of workshops on innovation, or seek out external coursework that we can take. Maybe go out to a university and find something on being innovative and creative or something like that. So they were really using the patterns that they saw from a year in and year out basis to try to get a sense of where they could focus their development. So when you step back and take a look at the multi-year evolution of this case, I think you can see that starting off small, recognizing where the culture's at, but then moving it forward and progressively leveling it up through the model for change, making sure you've got relevant data, making sure that or content, making sure the data is relevant is critical, but accountability can come a little bit later. Make sure census participation is there, but as you move through the process and react and respond to what you're seeing. So we were moving as quickly as we saw the leaders moving and changing. Thankfully, it didn't take them 6 years to get past the collaborative phase. But it did take a couple, and change is not always as quick as we'd like, particularly when you're trying to change the culture of an organization. It's not as easy to change your culture as it is to say change your operating system. It takes time, it takes focus, and it takes responsiveness to what's landing well in that particular environment. At the end of the day, the organization changed quite radically, much more optimism. In fact, at the end of this case, the CIO actually retired and moved on. But they had great sort of shared leadership down through the organization. There was considerably more trust. The value and the results they were getting for their internal clients was tremendous. Their satisfaction scores were, much higher. Satisfaction with the organization was much higher. So a real success story. Now, it's why did we get that success? What were those keys to success that made this such a great case? Well, clearly, let's give the CIO some credit. He was a tremendous leader, very good at inspiring others, also very good at making tough business decisions. Not for a moment would I pretend that he was not a critical aspect of this. It was his vision that was helping us make these changes and know when the right time was to shift the survey or add in a new component. And the partnership with him around what are the options, how can we get more accountability, was key to being able to give him an idea of what was possible, but also be in conversation with him about when those changes could be made. Also, the changes were incremental. He took the path of not making radical changes up front. He did make changes in the workforce. He did do some reorganization, but it was incremental. It wasn't huge, and I think that was critical for keeping the focus and confidence of the individuals. The other thing was, a real focus on developing strategy with the leadership team. So that one of the things that wasn't really emphasized so much is that the entire leadership team was involved in discussions around strategy. So I think that the leadership team felt they were a part of the solution and part of making the department more effective. But let's not overlook one of the critical keys here, which is that leaders had clear, specific behaviors that they knew were going to make a difference to achieve the strategic shifts. They had every year an opportunity to reflect on how did their behavior fit with the behaviors that were needed to achieve change in the organization that was needed by the business. So using the 360 in this way as a messaging tool, as an accountability tool, in a supportive developmental format was absolutely critical support to making sure that this organization could move forward and not get stuck in that sort of cycle of cynicism and resistance and really kind of risk intolerance. So I think the 360 process was absolutely a key component. So a little shameless plug for us, 3D Group. We've been doing this for a long time, specialize in 360 feedback. I hope that you found the case that we presented here to be valuable. If you do and you've seen some things that you'd like and are interested, please give us a call. We're happy to talk to you. If not, I hope you learned something new and use it to make your process better. We care about this work, and at the end of the day, it's about helping leaders get better and organizations grow. Thanks so much.